prosecutor. She travels the country teaching about the Constitution, and this is her second visit with us, so we're most grateful for her to come back. She's an Army veteran, a Russian linguist, a mother, a pastor's wife, and a patriot. She's originally from St. Louis, now lives in North Florida. And in learning more about her from your website is very interesting. She didn't come by all of this naturally. She was raised a Democrat. She was an ardent environmentalist, she said. She very much believed in global warming and defended it. She thought it was the government's duty and purpose to be the provider for the people. She supported abortion. But at last she found Christianity, and she states that she came to know the truth. And as such, she's been out and about teaching all about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and liberty. There were two books that particularly inspired her, I'm sure in addition to the Bible. Founding Brothers by Joseph Ellis, in case you haven't read it, it's wonderful, and 1776 by David McCullough. So, she's a very passionate speaker. We'll find her to be very much like Patrick Henry, I believe. And she speaks, like I said, across the country on constitutional history, American exceptionalism, and the fight for liberty. So please give a warm Texas welcome, a welcome back to KrisAnne Hall.
Thank you, everybody. So I got to visit the Alamo the last time, on this trip. And I started thinking, I bet a bunch of you, or a bunch of y'all, are sort of regretting the fact that y'all joined the Union at all, right? Never fear, you can undo that, right? All right. So, we have lots of people who are raising their hand, taking an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. How do you defend a document when you don't know what it means? How do you defend liberty when you don't know what it is? How do you secure the rights of the people when you're not even sure how to exercise your own? You see, we have failed to teach the proper things about the Constitution for so long now. We don't know where we came from. We don't know who we are. We don't know who our Constitution makes us who we're supposed to be. So we have no idea what we're supposed to be supporting and defending. We have no idea what we're supposed to be fighting for. And we don't know how to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Because frankly, we're a little confused on what liberty is altogether. Samuel Adams said, "No people will tamely surrender their liberties when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved." He said, but on the contrary, when a people become universally ignorant and debauched in their manners, they will sink underneath their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders. I'm sure here in Texas, you know, there is no doubt that you have a foreign invasion problem. But I will strongly suggest to you, and I believe you will walk away from this presentation fully convinced that your foreign invasion problem is not your biggest problem. Because the biggest problem in America, in my humble opinion, is our universal ignorance as to what liberty is and what our Constitution means. Because frankly speaking, if we understood properly what the Constitution means and how we're supposed to be operating, we wouldn't have a foreign invasion problem. And so what I want to do today is I want to teach you what our framers knew to be true. What drove them to do what they did? How many of you have read the Declaration of Independence lately? So when you've read the Declaration of Independence, who can tell tell me the three things that our founders pledged, the signers of the Declaration of Independence. What were the three things that they pledged to us? Life, not liberty, fortune, sacred honor. They didn't pledge that to each other. They pledged that to us. Samuel Adams also said that when we tamely surrender a lawless attack upon our liberties, we encourage it and involve others in our doom. He said it's a serious consideration that should weigh heavy upon our hearts, that millions yet unborn will be the miserable sharers of our experience. Liberty is a gift that you have to pay forward. How many veterans do we have here today? Our veterans did not secure liberty for us. Our veterans have secured liberty for our future, because liberty is a gift you pay forward. But we are whittling away at the future of liberty, enslaving our children to a servitude that I don't believe they'll be able to peacefully conquer. This is John Adams. John Adams leads off our lesson today because he's going to teach us some things that we need to reconnect with. The origin of liberty. Our liberty was not invented with the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. As a matter of fact, our Constitution was not written in 1787. There is absolutely nothing new, nothing novel, nothing invented or original in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, or our Bill of Rights. Every single bit was inherited from their fathers, from this understanding of what liberty really is. So let's look at this origin of American liberty. He says liberty must at all hazards be supported. Let's notice that he said liberty must at all hazards be supported. He did not say your job. He didn't say your home, your prosperity, your health care, or your national security. Above everything else is liberty. Because if you do not have liberty, you have nothing. You're a slave. Samuel Adams wrote in 1772, among the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, life; secondly, liberty; third, property; together, number 4, with the right to protect and defend them in the best means possible. See, these are your rights. And what John Adams is trying to explain to us is these rights don't come from documents. These rights don't come from government. They come from God. Because if they come from documents, when the documents change, so your rights do as well, right? If they come from government, if your rights come from government, then government can take them away, can they not? Your rights, in order to be inalienable, they must come from God. How does that work? How many of you heard of a principle called natural law? How many of you have read, because our framers, in understanding natural law, studied the treatise of John Locke. How many of you have read the complete treatise of John Locke? See, we look around the room, right? Just a handful of nerds who have plowed through the complete treatise of John Locke. If I had asked that question in 1765, how many people in this audience have read the complete treatise of John Locke? People would have been looking around the room the same way we did, but with a different result. See, they'd been looking around for the ones who had not read Locke. Because Locke, Montesquieu, Algernon, Hobbes were all standard reading for the average colonists. papers, those anti-federalist papers that we have so much trouble understanding today, were written so that the common man on the street could read and understand them. We talk about interpreting them. We talk about interpreting the Constitution, not because they're written in Mandarin Chinese. We don't lack the knowledge of the language to read these documents. We lack the knowledge, period. So now we're raised up in ignorance, believing that our judges and our lawyers who, go to law school. But how many of you realize we don't teach the Constitution in law school? We teach constitutional law, which is completely different. Constitutional law teaches our lawyers and future judges that they know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it. After all, they're all dead and, they lived a long time ago, so their opinions are irrelevant, and we have to pull together our superior intellect to tell them what they meant when they wrote the document, because after all, they were too stupid to know for themselves. Why? Because we don't teach the Constitution the way it's supposed to be taught anymore. We have generations of people running around thinking that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. What that translates to mean is it's not a document of foundational principles. It's a document that means whatever we want it to mean based on our current environment. But you got to set away 1,000 years of history in order to come to that conclusion. John Locke in Natural Law teaches that we are created in the image of God. And because we are created in the image of God, we've inherited certain things from God. One thing that we've inherited from God is freedom. God is the most free being in the universe, right? Raise your hand if it's your job to wake up every day and tell God how to run things. Now look, I saw you look at your wife. Just because we tell you what to do doesn't mean we got a direct line telling God what to do, okay? So not even us. We don't even do that. But we've inherited that freedom to do whatever we choose. We don't want to live in a place where people are free. And that's not sarcasm, that's realism. Because if you live in a place where people are free, that means we are free to lie. We are free to steal. We are free to murder. We are free to do whatever we want to do regardless of how that hurts anyone else. How many of you want to sign up for that piece of real estate? Because you see, liberty and freedom are not the same thing. Liberty is freedom plus morality. That shared morality that says, yes, I recognize I am free to steal, I am free to lie, and I am free to murder, but I will not, because it's wrong. Can I tell you a little secret that your legislators don't want you to know? How many of you want to know that? Okay. Are you ready? Listen closely. Laws don't stop crimes. The criminal justice system was not even designed to stop criminal activity. The criminal justice system was designed to identify the standards of society and create a mechanism to punish people for breaking those standards. If law stopped crimes, we would be a crime-free country because we got way too many laws. How many of you recognize I am free to murder my neighbor? Right? I am free to murder my neighbor. I'll suffer the consequences for murdering my neighbor, but I'm free to do that. There are only two things that will stop me from murdering my neighbor, and one of them is not laws. I am free to murder my neighbor, but I will not, because it's wrong. I am free to murder my neighbor, but I will not, because he's well armed. Laws don't stop crimes because laws can't change the heart. And John Adams is saying, look, this liberty is worth more than your life. What did Patrick Henry say? Give me liberty or give me death. That wasn't just rhetoric. They meant that. And when they signed the at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. Doesn't that sound familiar? Life, fortune, sacred honor. John Adams is saying, look, we didn't invent liberty. This was a lesson brought to us by our forefathers. And the only way we're going to understand what the Constitution means, how it's supposed to be applied, and our duty to the preservation of liberty is to know the lessons that our framers knew. See, we're not waiting for John Adams to be resurrected. We are not waiting for the return of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, or Samuel Adams. We are waiting for you to be them. And that will only happen when the proper knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved. So let's learn a little lesson. The lesson of time-tested, blood-bought principles that created our Constitution. And in order to understand that, we have to go back to our founders' forefathers in the year 1014. In understanding this, we need to know a little bit about society in 1014. There is no Great Britain. There is no Kingdom of England. There is only an Anglo-land, which means it's the land where the Anglo-Saxons are living. Now, prior to 1014, the Anglo-Saxons had lived in kingdoms, and most recently they had been ruled by the Danish kingdom. The problem is the Danish king has died, and the Anglo-Saxon has resisted the return of Danish rule. And they're doing a pretty good job. They're actually governing themselves in small communities quite successfully. And so successfully so that outside kingdoms are taking a notice. Obviously, the Danes want them back in, but that's not their only problem. So these kingdoms are looking in at the Anglo-Saxons and their successful small communities and saying, oh, look, those Anglo-Saxons are doing a pretty good job. But they're missing something. They don't have a king. They must need one. And so they keep attacking the Anglo-Saxons to incorporate them within their kingdoms. Now in 1014, when you live in a small community, it's, the next door community is probably a good day's ride away. So if, for example, the Danes are attacking you, you're not picking up your cell phone in 1014 and texting the next community and saying, hey, wait a minute, the Danes are here, come help us defend ourselves. So although they were doing very well, governing themselves in the small communities, they were having a couple problems. One of which was, now listen very carefully, they were having a hard time organizing themselves for their common defense. Now, if you want to keep a king or a kingdom from attacking you, in 1014, one of the best ways to do that is to have a treaty with that king. Problem is, the Anglo-Saxons have no king. And how many of you think that an outside kingdom is going to negotiate with a common man for treaty purposes? It's not going to happen. So the Anglo-Saxons come to the conclusion that they need a king for negotiation purposes and for other reasons. Now, how many of you recognize that kings are not elected? Kings are not chosen. Kings are born. It's a principle called divine right. It says God makes kings, and the only way you get to be king is if you're born in the right family and in the right birth order. So even if you're a man born in the right family, if you're the fourth born of 4 sons, you don't get to be king unless you can kill off 3 brothers, right? How many of you realize that happened? A lot. Okay? So recognizing, the Anglo-Saxons recognizing the principle of divine right, they go to this man named Ethelred. Now, Ethelred's family had been kings over the Anglo-Saxons back when they had Anglo-Saxon kings. Ethelred is an Anglo-Saxon, and they go to Ethelred and they say, look, we will allow you, listen to this language because it's very cool, we will allow you to be our king on one condition. Your only job is to help us organize for our common defense and to help us negotiate treaties with foreign kingdoms. You will leave us alone to govern ourselves in our small communities. Now, frankly, if we'd been teaching the Constitution properly for the last 100 years, light bulbs would be going off over everybody's head right now. Because you see, that is the Constitutional Republic Foundation. That is the exact same agreement that our states made when they created the central government through the Constitution. How many of you know a guy named James Madison? So I'm hoping you don't really know him, right? Anybody actually know him? Actually know of him, right? James Madison. What is James Madison's nickname? The father of the Constitution. So the father of the Constitution writes a document that we call Federalist Paper 45, in which he explains the relationship between the federal government and the states. He says the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. He says those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. He says the powers delegated to the federal government will be exercised principally on external objects. That's the way our founders would have referred to foreign affairs. And then he names them. He doesn't wait for the Supreme Court to define them for us. He names them. He says war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce. And then he ends his thought by saying everything else, all other powers, lives, liberties, properties of the people, internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state are reserved to the states. We didn't even invent that. That's the Ethelred Agreement. The states telling the federal government, your only job is foreign affairs, and you will leave us alone to govern ourselves. Problem is, how many of you heard of a guy named Solomon? He said, there is nothing new under the sun, right? Why? Because human nature never changes. Patrick Henry said, I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that's the lamp of experience. I know no way of judging the future but by the past. Because you see, in human nature, we have a tendency to make the same stupid mistakes over and over and over again. And Patrick Henry is saying, look, history is your greatest teacher. Because those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. See, history always repeats. But when you don't know it, you have to repeat the bad stuff instead of the good stuff. So what happens is human nature kicks in. And the funny thing is, when you start calling somebody a king, don't be surprised when he starts acting like one. And when people start looking to government to be their provider and their protector, don't be surprised when they start acting like subjects. So we're going to go 30 years now. Oh, look at that. I think my battery just died. My battery. It's a AAA. Yeah, that's okay. I can do it this way. We're going to go 30 years. So we have a new king. His name is Edward the Confessor. Now, Edward is described by the people in history as being a generous king. Now, think back to the Ethelred Agreement. Under the Ethelred Agreement, does the king have the authority to be generous to the people? No. 30 years, and we're already expecting free stuff from government. And they like it, right? Because when the government's handing out free stuff, most people don't like to ask where it came from. And so they like Edward because he's a generous king. Problem is, Edward's about to die, and he has no sons. He's raised up to rule in his generous manner, which means you have to go to a list of cousins who are next in line to be king. Next in line to be a king is this man, William I. Enter in our first problem. See, William I is not Anglo-Saxon. William I is from Normandy, and the Anglo-Saxons do not want him to be king. Why? Because they don't want a foreign leader over their kingdom. Imagine that. Right? Because a foreign leader brings, most of all, foreign law. So, they hatch out this plan to appoint a man by the name of Harold Godwinson to be king. Now, Harold has been Edward's right-hand man. They're fairly certain that Harold's going to rule in the same generous manner that Edward was going to, and so they appoint Harold king. Problem is, the year is 1066, and we're not appointing kings, we're not electing them, right? And William finds out that they've hatched out a plan to appoint Harold to be king, which makes him very angry, which is really bad news. Because you see, William has a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? He conquers. He raises up his Norman army. He goes over, defeats Harold and the English people, and makes himself king. See, poor Harold only has a very short reign. And in the Battle of Hastings, how many remember the Battle of Hastings? In 1066, Harold loses his throne and loses his life. Which means now that William is king. Now, William wants to rule as Norman kings rule. Remember, Anglo-Saxon kings are limited in their power. Their limiting factor is the common law. Norman kings are your stereotypical king. I say you do or else. That's the way William wants to run things. Now, a little bit of background. Every king has the power to issue law called decree. So William realizes that he could step up right now as king, issue a decree and say, we will now rule this kingdom under Norman law. Because God has seen fit to make me king, I am a Norman king, so we will now follow Norman law. Problem. You see, he's had to conquer these people to become king, so they don't really like him very much. And when you don't like your king, do you start a recall petition? Maybe you find a new king to run against him in the next kingly election. Is that how that works? No, when you live in a kingdom and you don't like your king, what do you have to do? Right, rebellion and chopping off his head. William knows this. He wants to stay king, wants to keep his head at the same time. So he realizes that stepping up, issuing a decree to change the law of the land is a very bad idea. So instead, he thinks it will be better if he can fundamentally transform the kingdom in such a way that the people don't recognize the changes that are being made. Now remember, the common law is the limiting factor to the king. So he has to get rid of this common law. He's not going to issue a decree to say there'll be no more common law, only Norman law. Instead, William is going to start replacing the judges in the common law system with judges who are not loyal to the common law, but loyal to the ideology of the king. So now he can use these judges to enforce the foreign law on the people of the kingdom, even when it's contrary to their common law. He is now going to use the legal system and the force of government to chase the landowners off of their land. He's even going to chase them sometimes completely out of the kingdom. Maybe they had some gopher turtles to protect or, water or something, right? Problem is, or benefit that is, when land becomes abandoned in the kingdom, who now owns the land? The king. So William's able to look out over the kingdom and go, look at all this land that's mysteriously and coincidentally, conveniently become abandoned. And it belongs to me now. He starts inviting all his foreign friends to come live in the kingdom. How else do you keep foreign law in a kingdom without losing your head, unless the kingdom is full of people who like the foreign law better than the common law of the land? Now, the churches are very powerful in this era as well, and William is not going to let that power slip through his fingers. So he starts replacing the leadership in the churches with men who are not loyal to their faith, not loyal to the Word of God, but loyal to the ideology of the king. So now he can start forcing the churches to teach the people to do things even when it's contrary to the Word of God. Because after all, William's on the throne by divine right of God. How dare you oppose the divine right? Now this transformation takes place over about 40 years through the reign of William I and his son William II, also known as William the Red. Why? Just kidding. Okay, he's a very hairy man, by the way. Very hairy, very red hair. Anyway, apparently I'm the only one that thinks that's funny. That's what happens when you turn into a history nerd. You think things are funny that nobody else does. So William II is described as being a wicked, evil king just like his father. Now the good news is William II is only going to rule for about 13 years. Because one day, William II and his little brother, Henry I, go hunting together. And William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident when a stray arrow from Henry's hunting party accidentally hits William right in the eye. Coincidentally and immediately making Henry king. How many of you think this was a coincidence? An accident, right? Well, the Anglo-Saxons weren't buying this story either. So Henry has to do some things to appease the people. Because yes, it is true, they did not like his brother. But they also recognize that if Henry will murder his brother to become king, then what is the value of the people to them? So Henry's got to do some things to make the people like him. One of the first things Henry does is he comes to the people and he says, look, I realize the circumstances surrounding the death of my brother may seem a bit suspicious. So what I'm going to do, I want to put your minds at ease. What I'm going to do is I'm going to scour the kingdom, and I am going to locate the 3 wisest men in all of the kingdom. And after I've located these 3 wise men, they are going to be charged with the duty of determining whether I'm at fault for the death of my brother or not. How's that going to work out with the government investigating itself? Do you suppose that it would work out better if they called it a congressional hearing? What do you think the verdict was? He is innocent of the death of his brother. Well, the people aren't buying this, so Henry's got to keep trying. And now we enter into the most important thing that Henry will do for our constitutional history. Our Constitution was constructed on the basis of 5 documents. 5 documents written over 700 years. These 5 documents are the written form of the British Constitution. And Henry I will sign the first one. It is called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. The 1100 Charter of Liberties is Henry's promise to the people of England that government will never be evil and oppressive again. How's that working out for us? Now, Henry's going to make a list of 13 things that government can never do, because if government does do it, we will be on notice that government's being evil and oppressive. Now, I'm going to share all 14 with you, but I did want to share this one. He says, if any baron or earl of mine shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Now remember, with the Williams, we had problems with the Williams stealing the land from the people. And Henry's saying, no, I'm not going to be like my father and brother. Because you see, if the heirs of an estate have to purchase their estate from the government before they can receive it, you have an evil and oppressive government. Is that ringing any bells out there? Has anybody heard of inheritance tax? Death tax? Isn't that what this is? I mean, seriously, don't pay your inheritance tax, see how much you get, right? So how is it that a king in 1100 recognized that inheritance tax was the mark of an evil and oppressive government, and yet we allow our governments to call it revenue? Because we've lost touch with liberty. We've lost our roots of our Constitution. Henry signs the 1100 Charter of Liberties not because he's interested in liberty, but because he's interested in keeping his head. But now we have a written promise by the king that binds every single king in the future. And they're going to need this promise because in 100 years, they're going to have the most evil king they'll ever know. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king. And if you cannot afford to pay your taxes in John's kingdom, which is highly likely, you're going to be arrested, thrown into prison, mutilated. He is cutting off hands, feet, ears, cutting the tongues out of people who cannot afford to pay their taxes, even executing them. You guys know John. You probably don't realize it. How many of you know this guy? That's the king in the Robin Hood stories. How many of you realize that we are suffering from a disease called historical revisionism? See, we don't even just distort the facts anymore, we distort the legends. Because we teach our children that we are supposed to respect and revere and look up to Robin Hood because he robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. Only that's not true. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive and unlawful taxation and returning it to the people so they could live. Remember, John's going to murder you if you can't pay your taxes. Robin Hood's not a socialist trying to put everybody on equal financial footing. He is a liberty fighter, giving people their lives back. Because you see, the first step to liberty is always a right to life. Because think about it. If you have to ask permission to live, you are not free. Now, the interesting thing that we need to learn from John's reign, and it is repeated throughout history, is that people do not go to war with their own governments over money. Let me just dispel a little myth out there. The Boston Tea Party was not about taxes. Okay? By the time we threw the tea in the harbor, the tax on the tea had been cut in half, and many of the other taxes had even been repealed. We do not go to war with our own government over money. It's got to be something more. Because you see, governments have figured out over the centuries that if you can keep your people focused on stuff, the stuff that they have, the stuff that they see, the stuff they think they can get, all you have to do is trickle down just enough stuff to make them happy subjects. Good news is, governments always get power drunk. They start thinking they can do anything to the people, and the people will never push back. And then they commit some fundamental error. John's fundamental error is this. The people have chosen a man by the name of Stephen Langton to be the head of their church. John steps up and says, I don't like this guy. I'm going to pick the leadership in your church. But you see, John's already forgotten about the 1100 Charter of Liberties. Because the very first promise Henry made was that the church would be free from government intrusion. You see, that's what separation of church and state means. That your government has no business in your church, and if the government is in your church, you have an evil and oppressive government. The interesting thing is separation of church and state for hundreds of years has meant that government has no business in your church. It's only been since our most bit of technological advancement, ignorant knowledge, that we've come to believe that God has no business in public discussion. And we had a king in 1100 that said, if the government is in your church, you have an evil and oppressive government. A rebellion comes against John, which brings us the second document in our history of our Constitution, the genealogy of our Constitution. This one's called the Magna Carta of 1215. Now, I'm fairly certain most of you have heard of the Magna Carta, right? I'm also fairly certain that many of you have never heard of the 1100 Charter of Liberties, which is a shame because, truth be told, the Magna Carta cannot exist without the 1100 Charter of Liberties. And when you leave out the 1100 Charter of Liberties, you miss a very, very important part of this understanding of liberty through history. Little pop quiz. Everybody in the room knows the answer to this question. I just taught it to you. Are you ready? Who wrote the 1100 Charter of Liberties? Henry I. The Magna Carta was not written by John. The Magna Carta was written by the people. The Magna Carta is the people standing up to the king saying, hey, you made us a promise in 1100 that government would never be evil and oppressive. You obviously have no idea how to keep your promise. So now we, the people, will rise in our majesty. We're going to place ourselves above the king. We are going to tell the king what he can and cannot do, so he will keep his promise. The Magna Carta creates a committee of 25 men called the Royal Council who sit in the king's court with the authority to tell the king, no, you can't do that because it breaks your promise. Our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th amendments in our Bill of Rights all come from clauses 38 through 40 in the Magna Carta. We did not invent them. We inherited them. Clause 61 gives us a very important part of our First Amendment. But before I tell you about that, I'm going to give you your second pop quiz of the day. You guys didn't know you're going to have pop quizzes, right? That's why they're pop quizzes. So no cheating and no answering out loud this time. I don't even want you to lip sync or mumble the answer because I don't want your neighbor to cheat off you, okay? No pocket constitutions or cell phones. I see you. Are you ready? There are 5 liberties in the First Amendment. To yourself, right now, I want you to name all 5 liberties in the First Amendment. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took a poll and asked this question. Found out that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. So if you're one of the people in the audience who can only name 4 or 3 or 2, and you've raised your hand that you will be elected to office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, how are you going to do that if you don't know what it says? If you are in this room and you're going to elect someone to office with the purpose of securing your rights, because that's the whole purpose of government, right? That's what the Declaration of Independence says, remember? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. The only purpose for government is to secure our rights. And if you're to elect somebody to do that, but you don't know what your rights are, how are you going to find the right person? And if you do not know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? Do you know there's not a single person in this room with constitutional rights? There is not a single person in America with constitutional rights. Why? Because the Constitution grants you no rights. The Constitution could catch on fire tomorrow and you would still have your rights. The government could go completely crazy and rewrite the Constitution, and yes, you would still have your rights, because your rights do not come from the Constitution. And in the same light, you don't have constitutionally protected rights either. How is that possible? Can the Constitution pick up a pen and write your representative a letter? Can the Constitution go sit in your senator's office and demand compliance? Thomas Jefferson said, the tree of liberty must be fertilized by the blood of patriots and tyrants every 20 years. We should thank God we haven't had to repeat that history, but what if we do? Can the Constitution pick up a sword for you? Because the truth is, the only defender of your rights is sitting in your seat. And if you do not know what they are, that means you are not exercising them, and they are already gone. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta gives us the last aspect of our First Amendment, the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. Now, John is going to sign the Magna Carta because he has a sword at his throat, and the people are going to remove him from the throne less than a year later. How many of you understand that kings being told what to do by people is not going to go over well? So for the next 400 years, these people are going to have to fight with their kings and a queen or so to maintain their liberties and control over government. And what we're going to do is fast forward to the year 1625. This is the king now. His name is Charles I. He's a young, handsome fellow, a bit of a party animal. They describe Charles as loving to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. Now, I don't know if they played golf in 1625. But whose money is Charles spending? How is he collecting their money? So apparently we've been paying for vacations for a long time. Now, that royal council created in 1215 is now called Parliament. And Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending, stands up to Charles and says, we will not pass any more of your laws until you get your spending under control. Can you imagine that? The legislative branch looking at the executive branch saying, we're going to defund you until you get a proper budget. Not an idea, right? Charles says, okay, fine. But wait a minute. I'm king. Why do I even need a parliament? And he dissolves parliament. Now, did he have to call in a sergeant-at-arms to remove parliament from the court? Or could he have just said to the people, you realize government must function, and there are things that you want us to do, and there are things that we want to do for you, but this parliament is obstructing us in every single turn. So I want to make a promise to you that if parliament will not legislate, I'm just going to go ahead and regulate. Or maybe he held the State of the Kingdom address and said, you realize that there are things that we need to do, and there are things that we realize you want us to do. And in order to do those things, we must have a well-functioning government. And Parliament keeps breaking down the cogs in the wheel. So I make a promise to you here today. If Parliament will not pass laws, I will. After all, I have a quill and a messenger. Isn't that the same as dissolving Parliament, declaring them irrelevant and powerless, and if they act like it, they are, right? Well, Charles has a little problem he's learned from the kings of the past. If you get too tyrannical too fast, they'll hold a sword at your throat. So he wants to keep spending the people's money, but he realizes by having just dissolved Parliament, if he passes a tax, that's too much too quick. So he comes to the people, he says, look, you realize government needs money to function, so we're going to be collecting money from you, but don't worry, it's not a tax. Because I'm going to issue a decree that's going to collect money from you. It's not a tax, see, because I'm calling it a forced loan. 5 knights stand up to the king and say, wait a minute. We took an oath to the Liberty Charters and to the people of this kingdom. tax mandate, we don't care what you call this. This is a violation of our Constitution and a violation of our oath. We will not enforce this law. We will not collect this tax. And while we're at it, we're not paying it either. This is, by the way, why you must have a constitutional sheriff. Because your sheriff is the most powerful defender of your liberties in your county. Do you realize that your sheriff is more powerful than your county commissioner? Your sheriff is more powerful than your state legislator and your governor. Your sheriff is more powerful in his county than your federal representative, your federal senator, or even the President of the United States. If the President of the United States comes into your county and commits a crime, your sheriff can arrest the President of the United States and he doesn't have to ask anyone's permission. I see a speed trap being set up here. Not only that, by constitutional republic establishment, by the design and the words of our framers, and the recognition of the Supreme Court of the United States, the federal government has no authority in your county without first receiving permission from your sheriff. And as a sheriff who has taken his oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, he knows that he should not allow any unconstitutional activity happening in your county, even if they flash a badge to do it. Now, Charles is going to arrest these 5 knights who stood against them, deny them their right to a fair trial. He's going to indefinitely detain them, and they're going to die, which doesn't take long in a prison in 1628. But you see, the people don't just stand by. A rebellion forms against Charles, which brings us the 3rd document in the genealogy of our Constitution. This one's called the Petition of Right of 1628. The Petition of Right of 1628 is a list of grievances against the king pursuant to Clause 61 in the Magna Carta on how the king has violated the Magna Carta and broken the promises of the 1100 Charter of Liberties. There'll be no taxation without representation, regardless of what you call it. Yes, we do have a right to due process. That is not something that the government can give and take away based on their convenience. And while we've got the sword at the king's throat, we're going to secure more liberty for the people and limit government even more. Because you see, you cannot declare martial law on us unless we're being invaded by a foreign nation, and you cannot quarter soldiers in our homes. We didn't invent the 3rd Amendment. We inherited it. Now, Charles is going to sign the Petition of Right the same way John did, with a sword at his throat, but the people will let him stay king. How many of you think that Charles has learned his lesson? Well, he did learn. He learned that if you're going to if you're going to take the people's money, you can't whim and fancy it. You've got to give them a good excuse. Now, the good news is the years between 1628 and 1641 provide Charles with the perfect excuse. Because you see, these are very violent times in Europe. There are wars everywhere. And Charles is able to come to the people and say, hey, you see that over there? You see all those wars our neighbors are fighting in their land? I need to ask you a very important question. Do you want those wars to come to our kingdom? Raise your hand if you want those wars to come to our kingdom. Well, of course not. I've got the perfect plan to keep those wars from coming here. It's perfect because, you see, you really don't have to do much. See, all you have to do is give me your tax dollars. And when you give me your tax dollars, I'll make sure all our allies are adequately funded in their wars. And they'll be superior in power and strength, which means they'll win their wars over there. And that means the wars will end over there. And if they end over there, what? They won't come here, right? See, I told you it was a perfect plan. You don't have to do much. It's just a matter of national security that you pay your taxes. But you see, the people are watching Charles very closely, and they're noticing something. Charles is lying to them. Charles is not funding their allies. He's funding their enemies. He's made a deal with the enemies. I help you win over there. You come over here and get my people back under subjection. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. The process, which brings us the fourth document, the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. The Grand Remonstrance of 1641 reads, "The root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design, subverting the laws and liberties of our people." So if we're going to translate that into modern English, what does that basically mean? We've been watching tyrannical government for about 600 years now, and we're beginning to notice a pattern. The same bag of tricks over and over again, whose only purpose is to overturn and undermine our liberty. And when you read this document, because you can if you go online and you read the grievances, then you see that plan. Corruption of the court system, always number one. Infiltration of foreign law. The government diminishing the property rights of the people. The government taking control of the church. The government creating fiat money to control the monetary system. And the government disarming the people while the government remained armed. We wouldn't know anything about that today, now would we? Are you guys familiar with Agenda 21 here? Let me see a show of hands. Who knows Agenda 21? If you don't know Agenda 21, go to YouTube, watch a video called Agenda 21 for Dummies. It's how I got started. So if you know Agenda 21, you know sustainable development. How many of you know sustainable development? Was not invented by the United Nations. Go read the Grand Remonstrance of 1641 and you will see that Charles I was engaging in sustainable development. Through the grievances, they said he was taking the private land from the landowners in the name of resource preservation, and I quote, depopulation. They also said that he was attempting to remove them from the gold and silver standard by creating brass fiat money, and in 1641 they said that was grounds for chopping off his head. Now, before you get too excited, 40 years later, brand new king, same old design. James II has learned from his predecessors that if you're going to take things from the people, you've got to give them something to distract them. And James is going to issue a decree. He says that will give the people something they've never had before. I'm going to give you religious liberty. See, you no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, anytime you want, with any pastor you want. Preach anything you want, and the government will not persecute you or prosecute you on one condition. Before you have church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said, and you must promise that you will never, ever, ever say anything bad about the king in church. See, that doesn't sound like religious liberty to me. That sounds like a 501c3. So we have a 501c3 with the same thing as James II's Declaration of Indulgence. So what's the difference between 2016 and 1688? The difference is, in 1688, the bishops stood up to the king. And they said, no. We have a promise over 500 years old that says the government will stay out of our church. We're not following your decree, and we're still going to preach whatever we want. James throws them in prison. Charges them with a crime called seditious libel. Seditious libel was that part you can't talk bad about the king. But James has learned from Charles, you've got to give them their day in court. Because if they don't get their day in court, they'll chop off your head. So he makes sure these bishops get their day in court, but he has nothing to fear, because you see, seditious libel is written in such a way that truth is no defense. So even if you're correct when you're talking bad about the king, you still have to die. 7 bishops got their day in court. The good news is 2 of them were acquitted. because they had judges who refused to enforce an unconstitutional decree. The other 5 were also acquitted because they had a jury of their peers who refused to find them guilty of an unconstitutional law. You see, we did not invent the essential checks and balances of trial by jury of our peers and the essential check and balance of jury nullification. We inherited them. A rebellion forms against James called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It's called the Glorious Revolution because they said hardly a shot was fired. James got so scared that they were going to chop off his head like they did Charles. He got on his horse and fled the entire kingdom. But from this we get the 5th document in our genealogy, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of our kingdom. Anybody here know what extirpate means? See, I didn't either. I had to look it up. It means to completely destroy. And they said what James was doing was completely destroying liberty. Let me do a check here. How many of you have now seen through this 700 years of history, the history of those days repeating today? You see how those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. Do you see how we did not invent the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights? Do you see that already? I want to show you one more. Because you see, this document was also written on the basis of Clause 61 of the Magna Carta, a list of grievances against the king. And in those grievances, they tell us exactly what James was doing to completely destroy liberty. I'm not going to share all of them with you. I only want to share one. They said James II was completely destroying liberty by writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law when that was a power reserved to Parliament alone. We did not invent separation of powers. They had separation of powers in 1688. They had an executive branch in the king, a legislative branch in Parliament, and a judicial branch. Separation of powers means powers cannot be shared between the branches and they cannot be stolen. And what they said was when the executive branch is writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that is a power reserved to the legislative branch, the only result can ever be the complete destruction of liberty. How is it that a people of 1688 with no cell phones, no Google Oracle, no CNN, no MSNBC, no Fox News knew that executive orders were the complete destruction of liberty, and today we do nothing except fund them because we've lost our attachment to liberty. You cannot defend liberty if you cannot define it. You cannot defeat tyranny if you cannot define it. Enter in George III, not the inventor of tyranny, but following the same old malignant and pernicious design. As a matter of fact, for our framers, the tyranny didn't begin with George III. It began with his grandfather, George II. So we're dealing with a William I, William II kind of king here. So George III is just picking up where his grandfather left off. And the Declaration of Independence is not a new novel document. It is an expression of Clause 61 of the Magna Carta on how George III has violated the English Bill of Rights, the Grand Remonstrance, the Petition of Right of 1628, the Magna Carta, and broken the promises of the 1100 Charter of Liberties. Go read the Declaration of Independence after you've read these 5 documents, and you will see Jefferson did not write the document as much as he did plagiarize it from these 5 documents. Why? He didn't need to. There is nothing new under the sun. And government justice does the same things over and over again. I mean, how many of you have read our Declaration of Independence and looked at those grievances and said, wow, that's what's happening right now? So how many of you remember from your history lesson that shortly after our victories with Great Britain, that there were people begging George Washington to be king? Should we be ever so grateful that there were some framers who said, wait a minute now, we've been trying that kingdom thing for about 700 years and it doesn't work out so well. You see, kings only keep their promises as long as you hold a sword to their throat. And the minute you drop the sword, kings go back to be kings and people go back to being subjects. How about let's not do the kingdom thing? Because you see, as the preamble tells us, we want to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Kingdoms do not preserve liberty. Kingdoms only preserve kingly power. Why? Because when you live in a kingdom, the king holds all the power and he hands out the privileges to the people as he sees fit. And if he's handing them out, what can he do? Take them away. You live in a kingdom, you wake up every day wondering what's right and what's wrong, because the king might have woke up in a bad mood and what was okay yesterday is no longer good today. And if you didn't get the memo, too bad. They said, no. Let's not do this kingdom thing. Let's create a constitutional republic. Because you see, a constitutional republic is the exact opposite of a kingdom. Because in a kingdom, the king holds all the power, hands out the privileges to the people as he sees fit. But in a constitutional republic, the people hold all the rights and delegate power to the government as they see fit. Remember? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. And if we hold all the rights and we're delegating power to the government as we see fit, what can we do? Take them away. Why? Because in a constitutional republic, we are the kings and government is the subject. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. But when any form of government operates destructive of these ends, it is the right, Jefferson would later say, it is the duty of the people to alter or abolish. Because only in a constitutional republic do the people control the government, and not the other way around. A constitutional republic where laws are created through equal representation, where equal justice can apply, because we're not a democracy. I teach about 265 lessons in over 22 states every single year. I teach high school, middle school students, college students. I teach churches about religious liberty. I teach groups like yours. I teach state legislators. Do you know I've taught the legislators of Arizona, Kansas, Utah, Missouri, Idaho, and Oregon. I'm thinking, if I can teach Oregon legislators, shouldn't I be able to teach Texas? Well, you guys can make that happen. Now, when I teach the young people, I like to ask them this question. What form of government is America? What do you suppose the most popular answer I get is? Democracy. Do you know that's our fault? It's our fault, because if we realized what a wicked, evil lie that was, we wouldn't simply roll our eyes and shake our heads as our teachers teach our children that. We wouldn't simply give our politicians a pass for calling us a democracy, and we wouldn't chuckle it off when our talking heads on our favorite conservative talk show or news channel calls us democracy. Because you see, democracy is an insidious lie to enslave the people. Our framers did not create a democracy, they created a constitutional republic. Why? Because the interest was to preserve liberty. Democracies do not preserve liberty. Democracies are mob rule. You know, there's really no difference between a democracy and a kingdom. The only difference between a democracy and a kingdom is how many people rule over you. In a kingdom, specifically a monarchy, it's one person. But in a democracy, it is mob rule. So what happens is the majority of the people holds all the power and hands out the privileges to the minority as they see fit. And if they're handing out the privileges to the minority, what can they do? Take them away. So if you're a minority in a democracy, you only have what you have as long as the majority says so. Do you know how I know we're not a democracy? If we had been a democracy, Rosa Parks would still be sitting in the back of the bus. Because only in a constitutional republic can a minority group, through equal representation, have a society-changing voice. Democracies do not preserve liberty. They only preserve that there will always be masters and always be slaves. Problem is, you repeat a lie long enough, it becomes the truth, right? So we might be okay with being a democracy, right? Might be good for you if you're always in the majority. But that moment, you're not. The moment you find yourself in the minority, you are nothing but a slave. How many of you want to sign up for that piece of real estate? It matters. It matters what we call our government. Liberty matters. The constitutional difference is that we are a republic and not a democracy. What is liberty? The fact that liberty is freedom plus morality, because laws cannot change the heart. Let me ask you a question one more time. How many of you have seen Patrick Henry's Truth of History repeating itself today? How many of you think that if we had been taught this history our whole lives, that our government would be operating differently today? Just be totally honest. How many feel a little overwhelmed at understanding right now just how corrupt our government really is? People always ask me, KrisAnne, do we have time? Can we turn this around? Is there any hope? Absolutely. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe it, and I want to show you the hope now. Because you've seen it, but let me connect the dots for you. This is why the history of our Constitution is so relevant and so important. Our Constitution is not a living, breathing document because it was written in irrelevance or, made irrelevant by today's times. How many of you see that it becomes more and more relevant with every tyrannical move our government makes? The hope is it's history. Alexander Hamilton said, experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred and conclusive. We started off with a promise from a king. And for 700 years, we stood against tyrannical government. We stood for liberty. And every single time we stood, we won. And we won big. From a promise to a king each step of the way, more liberty for the people, more limited government, until we get to the greatest human rights documents ever written by men in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. So look at this oracle of truth, this lesson of history. When we stand again, we cannot lose. We will win, and we will get something better. Don't our children deserve it? But we got to stop being universally ignorant. We got to start embracing virtue. And we got to start teaching the right truth. It's one thing to stand up boldly, but it's another thing to stand up boldly in truth. And it won't be popular, let me tell you. I just made the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of anti-government extremist groups. I must pack a powerful punch, right? Why? Because it's not me, it's truth. And they can't attack the truth, so they have to attack me personally. How many of you can think of at least 3 people who should have been sitting here with you today? Well, remember, I teach high school, middle school students, I teach college students, I teach all kinds of groups. So if you have any of these groups, all you have to do is contact me. As a matter of fact, tomorrow, I will be speaking at the Collin College Higher Education Boardroom on Article 5 and nullification. That starts at 7 p.m. tomorrow. Saturday, 2 classes at the Central Baptist Church in McKinney. Starts at 9 a.m. I will teach state sovereignty. The lessons that I teach the state and local governments is the lesson that I'll be teaching on Saturday. What is the Constitution? What kind of document is the Constitution? How was it formed? What are the states? What does that mean? What is the power of the states in control of the federal government? Those kind of things. And then, a very special treat, the second class will be taught by my husband. Are you here in the room, dear? He's out there. Tell him to stick his head in here. My husband is a former pastor, and he is now currently an active missionary to Haiti, which means we are also active missionaries to Haiti. This is my husband. Say hello. On Saturday, my husband will be teaching his class on the biblical duties of Christians to disobey the law. Did I say that right? It's going to be at the Central Baptist Church in McKinney. And if you want to know the exact details, times, and locations in the map, all you have to do is go to my website, KrisAnneHall.com. Click on the calendar, and it's there. How many of you have heard my radio show? I do have a radio show. It broadcasts 6 days a week. You can go to my website for the podcasts. How many of you have an iPhone? How many of you have an Android? Okay? If you guys go to your Play stores, you can search my name, KrisAnne space Hall. You will see my logo. You'll be able to download my mobile app for free. And then you will have all my radio shows. Look, they're only 38 minutes and 27 seconds long every day. And what I do is I take current events and teach them from a constitutional founder's perspective. And we do that every single day. Actually 5 days a week. Broadcasting on the 6th day on Genesis Communications Network. I also have a television show that broadcasts twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays, on the Christian Television Network. And you can find out how to watch the television show by going to the website. I am on Facebook, I am on Twitter, and we do the same things that we do on the radio show. We take current events and teach them from a constitutional perspective. I also teach a 5-hour workshop on Saturdays where I go through this history of the Constitution, and in the same manner, I walk through the Bill of Rights, 1 through 10. I show you where they came from, what they mean, how they're supposed to be working, how we're doing it. How many of you realize we're doing it wrong? How we're doing it wrong, and the solutions to making it right. I even have some bonus sections on there on due process and the 17th Amendment. And you can have this workshop on this 3 DVD set. We have the 3 DVD set out there. It's almost 6 hours of training, chaptered out in small segments on 3 DVDs, so you don't have to watch the whole thing all at one time. I have groups across the country that teach from this DVD set instead of having me come in, because you have to book me a year in advance for Saturdays. This is Janet. Wave her. Hi, Janet. She hates me right now for doing that. Janet is my assistant. She does all my scheduling, and she'll tell you Saturdays just don't happen unless they're next year. But you can teach your kids, you can teach your groups from these DVDs. We don't have any problem with that at all. Just don't burn them and sell them for me, okay? The classes tomorrow and Saturday come from this book, Sovereign Duty. Do you know what the most asked question I get when I go around the country is? What do we do to fix the government? What did he say? No. What do we do to fix the government, right? control. So the next question is, what do we do? It always comes that way. Problem is, if we've been teaching the Constitution properly, we'd already know what to do. And that's what this book does, Sovereign Duty. This is not me teaching you. This is me facilitating the framers' lessons for you. You see, they knew this history. Would it surprise you to know that they actually anticipated the government that we have today? Remember, the lady asked Benjamin Franklin, what kind of government did you give us? And he answered, a republic, if you can keep it. They knew that republics were the best way to preserve liberty, but they also knew that they were a fragile creature that required the jealousy and the vigilance of the people. But they knew through history that people fall asleep. And we stop paying attention to government, and we get distracted by things. So they laid out a plan for us through the creation of the Constitutional Republic, and that's what this book does. As a matter of fact, if you look at the back of this book, the entire back of the book is nothing but sources. Every quote and every document that I have in this book is cited back to its original text. That's how I teach. I don't read other people's history books. I teach because I've read the documents myself, and I want you to test me. You shouldn't believe anything that anybody tells you. How many realize that, right? We should be practicing critical thinking and proving to ourselves what we think to be true. It's the only way we'll own this. How many of you realize that we are not teaching what we're supposed to be teaching to our children in the schools about the history? How many of you like your kids to learn this history lesson that I taught you today? Well, see, all you got to do is contact me and we'll go teach it in your schools. But in the meantime, I have 2 books that I've written that teaches this history. The blue book is for non-readers. It's very colorful. The chapters are short. It's a read-to-me book, and each chapter has a poem in it so that your non-reader memorizes the poem, then they've learned the lesson of the chapter. I'm not here to entertain your children, although they are entertaining. I'm also here to teach them. The purple book is for independent readers. How many people in this room can read? I'm just teasing. This is written on a high school level, but I have to admit to you, I have lots of adults who buy this book because it's the only book that I have currently written that teaches this history that I have today. Not only that, these books carry short chapters on founders and framers that they don't get to hear about anywhere else. Anybody tell me the name of the first man to give his life in our liberty movement against Great Britain? You can't answer.
I know.
I don't know. Anybody? Shout it out if you know it. Crispus Attucks. Very good. Crispus Attucks was a freed slave who had become a whaler for the merchant marines. His ship was docked at the Boston port, and he heard an alarm go off on his ship, only to find out that, because an alarm means a fire, only to find out there was no fire, but that his own government had picked up arms against his own people. Crispus Attucks ran back below deck, got 55 of his shipmates, came out and gave his life so we could be free. There's a poem written about this day. It's actually the Boston Massacre. And this poem says, "Honor to Crispus Attucks, who was leader and voice that day, the first to defy and the first to die, with maverick car and gray. Call it riot or revolution, his hand first clenched at the crown. His feet were the first in perilous place to pull the king's flag down. His breast was the first one rent apart that liberty's stream might flow. For our freedom now and forever, his head was first laid low. Call it riot or revolution, or mob or crowd as you may. Such deaths have been seed of nations. Such lives shall be honored forever." Boston Globe reported on the funeral of Crispus Attucks that it was the largest attended funeral procession they had ever seen in the history of Boston. Over 10,000 people marching to honor Crispus Attucks. And we don't even know his name. Remember your pop quiz, name all 5 liberties in the First Amendment? That's why I wrote this book, Liberty First, The Path to Restoring America. This is the book that I call Constitutional Activism 101. How do you use the liberties of the First Amendment to publish, teach, and secure liberty for our future? Our children deserve that, don't they? And the liberties that you don't have are the liberties that they'll have to buy back tomorrow. Now, if you want me to teach your groups, all you have to do is go to my website, send me an email, Janet will get it, and she will find you the first available date. I don't charge any groups speaking fees. So unlike Hillary, you won't have to pay me $250,000 to come. I don't make any group compensate me for my travel or my expenses. We are not independently wealthy. We do not have a government grant. We do not have a grant from the Koch brothers. We have no grants. But we do believe that we have a Father who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, who is the author of our liberty, and for 6 years has been inspiring people like you to help us keep this mission going. And so it won't cost you anything to have me come and teach your school, your church, or your legislators, or your sheriff. But what's it costing us to remain ignorant? Winston Churchill said, if you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when the victory is sure and not too costly, you may have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. He said there may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope, because it's better to perish than to live as a slave. If you are under the age of 25, I want you to stand up in this room right now. Look around. Look at the little one in the back. See, I want you to see this. Because if we continue with the status quo, with the going along to get along and the voting of lesser of evils, these people will have to buy back a liberty that we were supposed to give to them. And history says they won't do it at the ballot box. History says they will do it with their blood. So I want to ask you, what kind of legacy do you want to leave behind for our posterity? And as you look in their faces throughout the rest of these days, ask yourself, what are you doing to defend their liberty? Because they will look back on us and judge us on that single factor. Life, fortune, and sacred honor was the gift given to us. And I believe our children deserve more. Thank you so much for bringing me in. Thank you for your love and support over the years. And remember, we have those other dates coming up, and I'd love to see you there. God bless everybody. Thank you.